A reading from Bear's Library. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Part 3 of 3.
The grave wound to Gregor, from whose effects he suffered for over a month, as no one dared to remove the apple, it remained embedded in his flesh as a visible memento, seemed to have reminded even his father that in spite of his current sorry and loathsome form, Gregor remained a member of the family, and must not be treated like an enemy, but as someone whom, all revulsion to the contrary, family duty compelled one to choke down, and who must be tolerated, simply tolerated. Even if Gregor had lost his mobility, and presumably for good, so that now, like an old invalid, he took an age to cross his room, there could be no more question of crawling up out of the horizontal. This deterioration of his condition acquired a compensation, perfectly adequate in his view, in the fact that each evening now the door to the living room, which he kept under sharp observation for an hour or two before it happened, was opened, so that, lying in his darkened room, invisible from the living room, he was permitted to see the family at their lit-up table, and with universal sanction, as it were, though now in a completely different way than before, to listen to them talk together. Admittedly, these were not now the lively conversations of earlier times, which Gregor had once called to mind with some avidity as he lay down exhausted in the damp sheets of some poky hotel room. Generally, things were very quiet. His father fell asleep in his armchair not long after supper was over. His mother and sister enjoined one another to be quiet. His mother, sitting well forward under the lamp, sewed fine linen for some hasherdashery. His sister, who had taken a job as a salesgirl, studied stenography and French in the evenings, in the hope of perhaps one day getting a better job. Sometimes his father would wake up and, as though unaware that he had been asleep, would say to his mother, "Oh, you've been sewing all this time," and promptly fall asleep again, while mother and sister exchanged tired smiles. With an odd stubbornness, his father now refused to take off his uniform coat when he was at home, and while his dressing gown hung uselessly on its hook, his fully dressed father dazed in his chair, as though ready at all times to be of service, waiting, even here, for the voice of his superior. As a result, the uniform, which even to begin with had not been new, in spite of all the precautions of mother and sister, rapidly lost its cleanliness, and Gregor often spent whole evenings staring at this comprehensively stained suit, with its invariably gleaming gold buttons, in which the old man slept so calmly and uncomfortably. As soon as the clock struck 10, his mother would softly wake his father and talk him into going to bed, because he couldn't sleep properly where he was, and proper sleep was precisely what he needed, given that he had to be back on duty at 6 a.m. But with the obstinacy that characterized him ever since he had become a commissionaire, he would always insist on staying at table longer, even though he quite regularly fell asleep there, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that he was then persuaded to exchange his chair for bed. However Gregor's mother and sister pleaded and remonstrated with him, he would slowly shake his head for a whole quarter of an hour at a time, keep his eyes shut, and refuse to get up. Gregor's mother would tug at his sleeve, whisper blandishments in his ear. His sister would leave her work to support her mother, but all in vain. His father would only slump deeper into his chair. Only when the women took him under the arms did he open his eyes, look alternately at them both, and then usually say, "What sort of life is this? What sort of peace and dignity in my old days?" And propped up by the women, He would cumbersomely get to his feet as though he was a great weight on himself. Let them conduct him as far as the door, then gesture to them, and go on himself, while Gregor's mother hurriedly threw down her sewing, and his sister her pen, to run behind him and continue to be of assistance. Who in this exhausted and overworked family had the time to pay any more attention to Gregor than was absolutely necessary? The household seemed to shrink. The maid was now allowed to leave, after all, a vast bony charman with a great mane of white hair came in the morning and evening to do the brunt of the work. Everything else had to be done by mother, in addition to her copious needlework. Things even came to such a pass that various family jewels, in which mother and sister had once, on special occasions, decked themselves, were sold off, as Gregor learned one evening from a general discussion of the prices that had been achieved. The bitterest complaint, however, concerned the impossibility of leaving this now far too large apartment, as there was no conceivable way of moving Gregor. Gregor understood perfectly well that it wasn't any regard for him that stood in the way of a move, because all it would have taken was a suitably sized shipping crate, with a few holes drilled in it for him to breathe through. No, what principally kept the family from moving to another flat was their complete and utter despair. The thought that they, in all their circle of relatives and acquaintances, had been singled out for such a calamity. The things the world requires of poor people, they performed to the utmost. His father running out to get breakfast for the little bank officials, his mother hurling herself at the personal linen of strangers, his sister trotting back and forth behind the desk, dozing the bidding of customers, but that was as far as the strength of the family reached. The wound in Gregor's back would start to play up again when mother and sister came back, having taken his father to bed, and neglected their work to sit pressed together almost cheek to cheek, when his mother pointed to Gregor's room and said, "Will you shut the door now, Grete?" And when Gregor found himself once more in the dark, while next door the women were mingling their tears, or perhaps sitting staring dry-eyed at the table. Gregor spent his days and nights almost without sleeping. Sometimes he thought that the next time they opened the door, he would take the business of the family in hand, just exactly as he had done before. After a long time the director figured in his thoughts again, and the chief clerk, the junior clerk, and the trainees, the dim-witted factotum, a couple of friends he had in other companies, a chambermaid in a hotel out in the provinces somewhere, a sweet, fleeting memory, a cashier in a hat shop, whom he had courted assiduously, but far too slowly. All these appeared to him, together with others he never knew or had already forgotten, but instead of helping him and his family, they were all inaccessible to him, and he was glad when they went away again. And then he wasn't in the mood to worry about the family, but instead was filled with rage at how they neglected him. And even though he couldn't imagine anything for which he had an appetite, he made schemes as to how to inveigle himself into the pantry, to take there what was rightfully his, even if he didn't feel the least bit hungry now. No longer bothering to think what might please Gregor, his sister, before going to work in the morning and afternoon, now hurriedly shoved some food or other into Gregor's room with her foot, and in the evening reached in with the broom to hook it back out again, indifferent as to whether it had been only tasted, or even, as most regularly happened, had remained quite untouched. The tidying of the room, which she did always in the evening, really could not have been done more curiously. The walls were streaked with grime, and here and there lay little tangled balls of dust and filth. At first Gregor liked to take up position for her coming in the worst affected corners, as if to reproach her for their condition. But he could probably have stayed there for weeks without his sister doing anything better. After all, she could see the dirt as clearly as he could. She had simply taken it into her head to ignore it. And at the same time, with a completely new pernickettiness, that seemed to have come over her, as it had indeed the whole family. She jealously guarded her monopoly on the tidying of Gregor's room. On one occasion, his mother had subjected Gregor's room to a great cleaning, involving several buckets full of water. The humidity was upsetting to Gregor, who lay miserably and motionlessly stretched out on the sofa. But his mother didn't get away with it either, because no sooner had his sister noticed the change in Gregor's room that evening than, mortally offended, she ran into the sitting room and, ignoring her mother's imploring raised hands, burst into a crying fit that her parents, her father, had of course been shaken from his slumbers in his armchair, witnessed first with helpless surprise, and then they too were touched by it. His father on the one side blaming Gregor's mother for not leaving the cleaning of the room to his sister, while on the other yelling at the sister that she would never be allowed to clean Gregor's room again, while the mother tried to drag the father, who was quite beside himself with excitement, into the bedroom. His sister, shaken with sobs, pummeled at the table with her little fists, and Gregor hissed loudly in impotent fury that no one thought to shut the door and save him from such a noise and spectacle. But even if his sister, exhausted by office work, no longer had it in her to care for Gregor as she had done earlier, that still didn't mean that his mother had to take a hand to save Gregor from being utterly neglected, because now there was the old charwoman. This old widow, who with her strong frame had survived everything that life had had to throw at her, was evidently quite undismayed by Gregor. It wasn't that she was nosy, but she had by chance once opened the door to Gregor's room, and at the sight of Gregor, who, caught out, startled, and scurried hither and thither, even though no one was chasing him, merely stood there with her hands folded and watched in astonishment. Since then, she left no morning or evening slip without opening the door a crack and looking in on Gregor. To begin with, she called to him as well, in terms she probably thought were friendly, such as, "Come here, you old dung-beetle," or "Will you take a look at that old dung-beetle?" Gregor, of course, didn't reply, but ignored the fact that the door had been opened, and stayed just exactly where he was. If only this old charwoman, instead of being allowed to stand and gawp out him whenever she felt like it, had been instructed to clean his room every day. Early one morning, a heavy rain battered against the window panes, a sign already, perhaps, of the approaching spring. Gregor felt such irritation when the charwoman came along with her words that, albeit slowly and ponderously, he made as if to attack her. The charwoman, far from being frightened, seized the chair that was standing near the door, and as she stood there with mouth agape, it was clear that she would only close it when she thought the chair crashing down on Gregor's back. "So is that as far as it goes, then?" she asked, as Gregor turned away, and she calmly put the chair back in a corner. Gregor was now eating almost nothing at all, only sometimes, happening to pass the food that had been put out for him, he would desultorily take a morsel in his mouth and keep it there for hours, before usually spitting it out again. At first he thought it was grief about the condition of his room that was keeping him from eating, but in fact the alterations to his room were the things he came to terms with most easily. They had started pushing things into his room that would otherwise have been in the way, and there were now a good many such items, since one room in the flat had been let out to a trio of bachelors. These serious-looking gentlemen, all three wore full beards, as Gregor happened to see once, peering through a crack in the door, were insistent on hygiene, not just where their own room was concerned, but throughout the flat, where they were now tenants, and therefore most especially in the kitchen. Useless or dirty junk was something for which they had no tolerance. Besides, they had largely brought their own furnishings with them. For that reason, many things had now become superfluous, that couldn't be sold, and that one didn't want to simply throw away either. All these things came into Gregor's room, and also the ash can and the rubbish bin from the kitchen. Anything that seemed even temporarily surplus to requirements was simply slung into Gregor's room by the charwoman, who was always in a tearing rush. It was fortunate that Gregor rarely saw more than the hand and the object in question, whatever it was. It might be that the charwoman had it in mind to reclaim the things at some future time, or to go in and get them all out one day. But what happened was what they simply lay where they had been thrown, unless Gregor, crawling about among the junk, happened to displace some of it. At first perverse, because there was simply no more room in which to move, but later on with increasing pleasure, even though after such peregrinations he would find himself heart-sore and weary to death, and wouldn't move for many hours. Since the tenants sometimes took their supper at home in the shared living room, the door to it remained closed on some evenings, but Gregor hardly missed the opening of the door. After all, there were enough evenings when it had been open, and he had not profited from it, but instead, without the family noticing at all, had merely lain still in the darkest corner of his room. On one occasion, however, the charwoman had left the door to the living room slightly ajar, and it remained ajar even when the tenants walked in that evening, and the lights were turned on. They took their places at the table, where previously father and mother and Gregor had sat, unfurled their napkins, and took up their eating irons. Straightway his mother appeared in the doorway, carrying a dish of meat, and hard behind her came his sister with a bowl heaped with potatoes. The food steamed mightily. The tenants inclined themselves to the dishes in front of them, as though to examine them before eating, and the one who was sitting at the head of the table, and who seemed to have some authority over the other two flanking him, cut into a piece of meat in the dish, as though to check whether it was sufficiently done, and didn't have to be sent back to the kitchen. He seemed content with what he found, and mother and sister, who had been watching in some trepidation, broke into relieved smiles. The family were taking their meal in the kitchen. Even so, before going in there, the father came in and with a single reverence, cap in hand, walked once around the table. All the tenants got up and muttered something into their beards. Once they were on their own again, they ate in near silence. It struck Gregor that out of all the various sounds one could hear, it was that of their grinding teeth that stood out, as though to demonstrate to Gregor that teeth were needed to eat with, and the best toothless gums were no use. "But I do have an appetite," Gregor said to himself earnestly, "only not for those things, the way those tenants fill their boots, while I'm left to starve." On that same evening, Gregor couldn't recall having heard the violin once in all this time. It sounded from the kitchen. The tenants had finished their supper. The one in the middle had produced a newspaper and given the other two a page apiece, and now they were leaning back, reading and smoking. When the violin sounded, they pricked up their ears, got up and tiptoed to the door of the hallway, where they stayed pressed together. They must have been heard from the kitchen, because father called out, "Do the gentlemen have any objection to the music? It can be stopped right away." "On the contrary," said the middle gentleman, "mightn't the young lady like to come in to us and play here, where it's more cozy and convenient?" "Only too happy to oblige," called the father, as if he were the violin player. The gentlemen withdrew to their dining room and waited. Before long up stepped the father with the music stand, the mother with the score, and the sister with the violin. Calmly the sister set everything up in readiness. The parents, who had never let rooms before, and therefore overdid politeness towards the tenants, didn't even dare to sit in their own chairs. Gregor's father leaned in the doorway, his right hand pushed between two buttons of his closed coat. Gregor's mother was offered a seat by one of the gentlemen, and now, presuming to move, remained sitting just where the gentleman had put her, off in a corner. The sister began to play. Father and mother, each on their respective side, attentively followed the movements of her hands. Gregor, drawn by the music, had slowly inched forward, and his head was already in the living room. He was no longer particularly surprised at his lack of discretion, where previously this discretion had been his entire pride, even though now he would have had additional cause to remain hidden, because as a result of the dust that lay everywhere in his room and flew up at the merest movement, he himself was covered with dust. On his back and along his sides he dragged around an assortment of threads and hairs and bits of food. His indifference to everything was far too great for him to lie down on his back, as he had done several times the day before, and rub himself clean on the carpet. And in spite of his condition, he felt no shame at moving out on the pristine floor of the living room. Admittedly, no one paid him any regard. The family was completely absorbed by the violin playing. The tenants, on the other hand, hands in pockets, had initially taken up position far too close behind the music stand, so that they could all see the music, which must surely be annoying his sister. But before long, heads lowered in half-loud conversation, they retreated to the window, where they remained, nervously observed by the father. It really did look all too evident that they were disappointed in their expectation of hearing some fine or entertaining playing. They were fed up with the whole performance, and only suffered themselves to be disturbed out of politeness. The way they all blew their cigar smoke upwards from their noses and mouths indicated in particular a great nervousness on their part, and yet his sister was playing so beautifully. Her face was inclined to the side, and sadly and searchingly her eyes followed the columns of notes. Gregor crept a little closer, and held his head close to the ground, so as to be prepared to meet her gaze. Could he be an animal, to be so moved by music? It was as though he sensed a way to the unknown sustenance he longed for. He was determined to go right up to his sister, to pluck at her skirt, and so let her know she was to come into his room with her violin, because no one rewarded music here as much as he wanted to reward it. He would not let her out of his room, at least not as long as he lived. For the first time his frightening form would come in useful for him. He would appear at all doors to his room at once and hiss in the faces of attackers. But his sister wasn't to be forced. She was to remain with him of her own free will. She was to sit by his side on the sofa, and he would tell her he was resolved to send her to the conservatory, and that if the calamity hadn't struck, he would have told everyone so last Christmas. Was Christmas past? Surely it was, without brooking any objections. After this declaration, his sister would burst into tears of emotion, and Gregor would draw himself up to her oxter and kiss her on the throat, which, since she started going to the office, she wore exposed, without a ribbon or a collar. "Mr. Samsa," cried the middle of the gentleman, and not bothering to say another word, pointed with his index finger at the slowly advancing Gregor. The violin stopped. The middle gentleman first smiled, shaking his head as his two friends, and then looked at Gregor once more. His father seemed to think it his first priority, even before driving Gregor away, to calm the tenants, though they were not at all agitated, and in fact seemed to find Gregor more entertaining than they had the violin playing. He hurried over to them, and with outspread arms tried simultaneously to push them back into their room, and with his body to block their sight of Gregor. At this point they seemed to lose their temper. It wasn't easy to tell whether it was the father's behavior or the understanding now dawning on them that they had been living next door to someone like Gregor. They called on the father for explanations. They too started waving their arms around, plucked nervously at their beards, and were slow to retreat into their room. In the meantime, Gregor's sister had overcome the confusion that had befallen her after the sudden interruption in her playing. Had her, after holding her violin and bow in her slackly hanging hands a while and continuing to read the score as if still playing, suddenly got a grip of herself, deposited the instrument in the lap of her mother, who was still sitting on her chair struggling for breath, and ran into the next room, which the tenants, yielding now to pressure from her father, were finally more rapidly nearing. Gregor could see how, under the practiced hands of his sister, the blankets and pillows on the beds flew up in the air and were plumped and pulled straight. Even before the gentlemen had reached their rooms, she was finished with making the beds, and had slipped out. Father seemed once more so much in the grip of his stubbornness that he quite forgot himself towards the tenants. He merely pushed and pushed till the middle gentleman stamped thunderously on the floor, and so brought him to a stop. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand, with his glare taking in also mother and sister, "that as a result of the vile conditions prevailing in this flat and in this family," here he spat emphatically on the floor, "I am giving notice with immediate effect. I, of course, will not pay 1 cent for the days I have lived here. In fact, I will think very carefully whether or not to proceed with, believe me, very easily substantiated claims against you." He stopped and looked straight ahead of him, as though wanting for something else, and in fact his two friends chimed in with the words, "We too are giving in our notice with immediate effect." Thereupon he seized the doorknob and slammed the door with a mighty crash. Gregor's father, with shaking hands, tottered to his chair and slumped down into it. It looked as though he were settling to his regular evening snooze, but the powerful nodding of his somehow disconnected head showed that he was very far from sleeping. All this time Gregor lay just exactly where he had been when the tenants espied him. Disappointment at the failure of his plan, perhaps also a slight faintness from his long fasting, kept him from being able to move. With a certain fixed dread, he awaited the calamity about to fall upon his head. Even the violin failed to startle him, when it slipped through the trembling fingers of his mother, and with a jangling echo fell to the floor. "Dear parents," said the sister, and brought her hand down on the tabletop to obtain silence, "things cannot go on like this. You might not be able to see it, but I do. I don't want to speak the name of my brother within the hearing of that monster, and so I will merely say we have to try to get rid of it. We did as much as humanly possible to try and look after it and tolerate it. I don't think anyone can reproach us for any measure we have taken or failed to take." "She's right, 1,000 times right," his father muttered to himself. His mother, who with an expression of derangement in her eyes was still experiencing difficulty breathing, started coughing softly into her cupped hand. His sister ran over to her mother and held her by the head. The sister's words seemed to have prompted some more precise form of thought in the father's mind, and he sat up and was toying with his doorman's cap among the plates, which still hadn't been cleared after the tenant's meal, from time to time shooting a look at the silent Gregor. "We must try and get rid of it," the sister now said to her father alone, as her mother was caught up with her coughing and could hear nothing else. "Otherwise it'll be the death of you. I can see it coming. If we have to work as hard as we all are at present doing, it's not possible to stand this permanent torture at home as well. I can't do it any more." And she burst into such a flood of tears that they flowed down onto her mother's face, from which she wiped them away with mechanical movements of her hand. "My child," said her father compassionately, and with striking comprehension, "but what shall we do?" Grete merely shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the uncertainty into which, in striking contrast to her previous conviction, she had now fallen in her weeping. "If only he understood us," said the father, with rising intonation. The sister, still weeping, waved her hand violently to indicate that such a thing was out of the question. "If only he understood us," the father repeated, by closing his eyes, accepting the sister's conviction of the impossibility of it, "then we might come to some sort of settlement with him. But as it is—" "We must get rid of it," cried the sister again. "That's the only thing for it, father. You just have to put from your mind any thought that it's Gregor. are continuing to think that it was for such a long time. Therein lies the source of our misfortune. But how can it be Gregor? If it was Gregor, he would long ago have seen that it's impossible for human beings to live together with an animal like that, and he would have left of his own free will. That would have meant I didn't have a brother, but we at least could go on with our lives and honor his memory. But as it is, this animal hounds us, drives away the tenants, evidently wants to take over the whole flat and throw us out on the street. Look, father, she suddenly broke into a scream. He's coming again. And in an access of terror, wholly incomprehensible to Gregor, his sister even quit her mother, actually pushing her away from her chair, as though she would rather sacrifice her mother than remain anywhere near Gregor, and dashed behind her father, who, purely on the basis of her agitation, got to his feet and half raised his arms to shield the sister. Meanwhile, Gregor, of course, didn't have the least intention of frightening anyone, and certainly not his sister. He had merely begun to turn around, to take his way back to his room, which was somewhat laborious and eye-catching process, as in consequence of his debility he needed his head to help with such difficult maneuvers, raising it many times and bashing it against the floor. He stopped and looked around. His good intentions seemed to have been acknowledged. It had just been a momentary fright he had given them. Now they all looked at him sadly and silently. There lay his mother in her armchair, with her legs stretched out and pressed together, her eyes almost falling shut with fatigue. His father and sister were sitting side by side, his sister having placed her hand on her father's neck. Well, maybe they'll let me turn around now, thought Gregor, and recommence the maneuver. He was unable to suppress the odd grunt of effort, and needed to take periodic rests as well. But nobody interfered with him, and he was allowed to get on with it by himself. Once he had finished his turn, he straightway set off wandering back. He was struck by the great distance that seemed to separate him from his room, and was unable to understand how, in his enfeebled condition, he had just a little while ago covered the same distance, almost without noticing. Intent on making the most rapid progress he could, he barely noticed that no word, no exclamation from his family distracted him. Only when he was in the doorway did he turn his head, not all the way, as his neck felt a little stiff, but even so he was able to see that behind him nothing had changed, only that his sister had got up. His last look lingered upon his mother, who was fast asleep. No sooner was he in his room than the door was pushed shut behind him, and locked and bolted. The sudden noise so alarmed Gregor that his little legs gave way beneath him. It was his sister who had been in such a hurry. She had been already standing on tiptoe, waiting, and had then light-footedly leaped forward. Gregor hadn't even heard her until she cried, "At last!" as she turned the key in the lock. What now? Wondered Gregor, and looked around in the dark. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move. It came as no surprise to him, if anything. It seemed inexplicable that he had been able to get as far as he had on his frail little legs. Otherwise, he felt as well as he could be expected. He did have pains all over his body, but he felt they were gradually abating and would finally cease altogether. The rotten apple in his back and the inflammation all around it, which was entirely coated with a soft dust, he barely felt that any more. He fought back on his family with devotion and love. His conviction that he needed to disappear was, if anything, still firmer than his sister's. He remained in this condition of empty and peaceful reflection until the church clock struck 3 a.m. The last thing he saw was the sky gradually lightening outside his window, when his head involuntarily dropped and his final breath passed feebly from his nostrils. When the charwoman came early in the morning, so powerful was she and in such a hurry that even though she had repeatedly been asked not to, She slammed all the doors so hard that sleep was impossible after her coming. She at first found nothing out of the ordinary. Then she paid her customary brief call on Gregor. She thought he was lying there immobile on purpose, and was playing at being offended, in her opinion. He was capable of all sorts of understanding. Because she happened to be holding the long broom, she tried to tickle Gregor away from the door. When that bore no fruit, she grew irritable and jabbed Gregor with the broom, and only when she had moved him from spot without any resistance on his part did she take notice. When she understood what the situation was, her eyes went large and round. She gave a half-involuntary whistle, didn't stay longer, but tore open the bedroom door and loudly called into the darkness, "Have a look! It's gone and perished. It's lying there, and it's perished." The Samsas sat up in bed, and had trouble overcoming their shock at the charwoman's appearance in their room, before even beginning to register the import of what she was saying. But then Mr. and Mrs. Samsa hurriedly climbed out of bed, each on his or her respective side, Mr. Samsa flinging a blanket over his shoulders, Mrs. Samsa coming along just in her nightdress, and so they stepped into Gregor's room. By now the door from the living room had been opened as well, where Grete had slept ever since the tenants had come. She was fully dressed, as if she hadn't slept at all, and her pale face seemed to confirm that. "Dead?" said Mrs. Samsa, and looked questioningly up at the charwoman, even though she was in a position to check it all out herself, and in fact could have seen it without needing to check. "I should say so," said the charwoman, and by way of proof, with her broom pushed Gregor's body across the floor a ways. Mrs. Samsa moved as though to restrain the broom, but did not do so. "Ah," said Mr. Samsa, "now we can give thanks to God." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Grete, not taking her eye off the body, said, "Look how thin he had become. He stopped eating such a long time ago. I brought food in and took it out, and it was always untouched." Indeed, Gregor's body was utterly flat and desiccated, only so apparent now that he was no longer up on his little legs, and there was nothing else to distract the eye. "Come in with us a bit, Grete," said Mrs. Samsa, with a melancholy smile, and not without turning back to look at the corpse. Grete followed her parents into the bedroom. The charwoman shut the door and opened the window as far as it would go. In spite of the early hour, there was already something sultry in the morning air. It was, after all, the end of March. The three tenants emerged from their room and looked around for their breakfast in outrage. They had forgotten about "Where's our breakfast?" the middle gentleman sulkily asked the charwoman. She replied by setting her finger to her lips, and then quickly and silently beckoning the gentleman into Gregor's room. They followed, and with their hands in their pockets on their somewhat shining little jackets, stood around Gregor's body in the bright, sunny room. The door from the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All were a little teary, and from time to time Grete pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my house at once," Mr. Samsa said, and pointing to the door, without relinquishing the women. "How do you mean?" said the middle gentleman, with a little consternation, and smiled a saccharine smile. The other two kept their hands behind their backs and rubbed them together incessantly, as if in the happy expectation of a great scene, which was sure to end well for them. "I mean just exactly what I said," replied Mr. Samsa, and with his two companions walked straight towards the tenant. To begin with, the tenant stood his ground and looked at the floor, as if the things in his head were recombining in some new arrangement. "Well, I suppose we'd better go then," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa, as if he required authority for this novel humility. Mr. Samsa merely nodded courteously at him with wide eyes. Thereupon the gentleman did indeed swing into the hallway with long strides. His two friends had been listening for a little while, their hands laid to rest, and now skipped after him, as if afraid Mr. Samsa might get to the hallway before them and cut them off from their leader. In the hallway, all three took their hats off the hat stand, pulled their canes out of the umbrella holder, bowed silently, and left the flat. Informed by what turned out to be a wholly unjustified suspicion, Mr. Samsa and his womenfolk stepped out on the landing. Leaning against the balustrade, they watched the three gentlemen proceeding slowly but evenly down the long flight of stairs, disappearing on each level into a certain twist of the stairwell, and emerging a couple seconds later. The further they descended, the less interest the Samsa family took in their progress, and when a butcher's apprentice passed them and eventually climbed up much higher with his tray on his head, Mr. Samsa and the women left the balustrade altogether, and all turned back with relief into their flat. They decided to use the day to rest and to go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they stood in dire need of one. And so they all sat down at the table and wrote 3 separate letters of apology. Mr. Samsa to the board of his bank, Mrs. Samsa to her haberdasher, and Greet to her manager. While they were so engaged, the charwoman came in to say she was leaving, because her morning's tasks were done. The 3 writers at first merely nodded without looking up, and only when the charwoman made no move to leave did they look up in some irritation. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood smiling in the doorway, as though she had some wonderful surprise to tell the family about, but would only do so if asked expressively about it. The almost vertical ostrich feather in her hat, which had annoyed Mr. Samsa the whole time she had been working for them, teetered in every direction. "So what is it you want?" asked Mrs. Samsa, who was the person most likely to command respect from the charwoman. "Well," replied the charwoman, and her happy laughter kept her from speaking. "Well, just to say, you don't have to worry about how to get rid of the thing next door. I'll take care of it." Mrs. Samsa and Greet inclined their heads over their letters, as if to go on writing. Mr. Samson, who noticed that the woman was about to embark on a more detailed description of everything, put up a hand to cut her off. Being thus debarred from speaking, she remembered the great rush she was in, and evidently piqued, called out, "Well, so long, everyone," spun around, left the apartment with a terrible slamming of doors. "I'm letting her go this evening," said Mr. Samsa, but got no reply from wife or daughter, because the reference to the charwoman seemed to have disturbed their concentration no sooner than it had returned. The 2 women rose, went over to the window, and stayed there, holding one another in an embrace. Mr. Samsa turned towards them in his chair and watched them in silence for a while. Then he called, "Well, now, come over here, leave that old business, and pay a little attention to me." The women came straight away and caressed him and finished their letters. Then the 3 of them all together left the flat, which was something they hadn't done for months, and took the tram to the park at the edge of the city. The carriage in which they sat was flooded with warm sunshine. Sitting back comfortably in their seats, they discussed the prospects for the future. It turned out that on closer inspection, they were not at all that bad, because the work of all of them, which they had yet to talk about properly, was proceeding in a very encouraging way, particularly in regard to future prospects. The greatest alleviation of the situation must be produced by moving house. They would take a smaller, cheaper, but also better situated and more practical apartment than their present one, which Gregor had found for them. While they were talking in these terms, almost at one and the same time, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa noticed their increasingly lively daughter. The way that of late, in spite of the trouble that had made her cheeks pale, she had bloomed into an attractive and well-built girl. Falling silent and communicating almost unconsciously through glances, they thought it was about time to find a suitable husband for her, and it felt like a confirmation of their new dreams and their fond intentions when, as they reached their destination, Their daughter was the first to get up and stretch her nubile young body. The end.
This concludes our 3-part reading of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed reading it out loud. If you have other suggestions for classic reads, poems, short stories that you would like to hear out here on YouTube, please comment on the video or send me a message. I look forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, if you enjoyed it, please consider a subscription to the channel and hit that bell for notifications so you know of all the other things we're doing. Have a great day. Bear out.